In the heavy August heat of 1942, the jungle of Guadalcanal was more than just a jungle. It felt like a giant, breathing creature. Thick vines, tangled undergrowth, and razor-sharp kunai grass formed a green wall so dense that a man could barely see 30 yards ahead. Somewhere inside that humid maze, a Japanese infantryman crouched low, holding his Type 38 rifle tight against his chest. He believed he was ready for this moment, the close-range fighting where Japanese spirit and steel would crush any American in front of him. But there was one thing no training manual had warned him about, no officer had mentioned, and no tradition of the Imperial Japanese Army had ever imagined. The weapon waiting for him was not one that Japanese officers had ever considered suitable for the battlefield, and it was something far outside their normal training. It was the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, a weapon that the Japanese army had mostly ignored, and many of their planners thought of it more as a hunting tool than as a serious military arm. Strange idea, right? Shotguns were almost never included in their tactical thinking, and Japanese training manuals rarely mentioned them at all. A small gap on paper, but a violent surprise in real combat. During America's first offensive in the Pacific, some Marine units carried Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 shotguns into the jungle, and they used them with the kind of confidence that came from earlier close combat training. Around 25,000 Model 97 shotguns, and between 50,000 and over 60,000 Model 12 shotguns were in U.S. service during World War II, including both newly made guns and older guns brought back into use, quietly shaping the battles ahead. So what happens when a complete military doctrine meets a weapon it never even considered? What happens when a hunter's tool becomes a nightmare in the jungle? And what truly decides victory in war, the theories written in manuals or the brutal reality on the ground? This was one of the first major times that Japanese infantry faced American shotguns in real combat. A story about the difference between ideas and experience, between confidence and shock, and between the war we expect and the war we actually face. To understand why the Japanese military never anticipated shotguns in American hands, we must first understand the philosophy that shaped their entire approach to the Pacific War. In early 1942, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the flagship Yamato and contemplated the string of victories stretching from Pearl Harbor to Singapore, he understood a harsh mathematical reality that many of his colleagues preferred to ignore. Japan produced less steel in a single year than America produced in a single month. Japan's limited industrial base forced its army to rely more on infantry training and fighting spirit, and this approach mixed practical needs with cultural ideas about courage and discipline. Some accounts claim that Yamamoto warned Japan might win early victories, but could not fight a long war against the United States, although these stories are not confirmed by reliable sources. But the admiral, who knew Americans well from his time as naval attaché in Washington, added a warning that many chose not to hear. We must get a peace agreement within a year and a half. The tactical expression of this spiritual over-material philosophy became deeply embedded in Japanese infantry doctrine. Night infiltration attacks followed by close quarters combat with rifle and bayonet became the standard approach. Japanese soldiers trained extensively in these tactics, and they had proven devastatingly effective against Chinese forces, British troops in Malaya, and American defenders in the Philippines. The standard engagement sequence was clear and simple. Approach under cover of darkness, infiltrate enemy lines, then overwhelm defenders at close range, where Japanese superiority in hand-to-hand combat would prove decisive. Every element of this doctrine assumed control of the close-range battlefield. Japanese soldiers were taught that when fighting distances collapsed to within 10 or 20 yards, their training, discipline, and warrior spirit would carry the day. They prepared for enemy rifles that took time to aim and fire. They trained to close distance against machine guns that could be flanked or suppressed. They practiced rushing positions defended by men they had been told were soft, individualistic Americans who would break under the pressure of cold steel and fierce determination. Japanese troops rarely trained to face American shotguns. American trench shotguns could deliver powerful buckshot at close range, and although their rate of fire was high, it was not as fast in real combat as some descriptions suggest. The Japanese military's training materials from this period reveal the completeness of this blind spot. Captured documents addressed in meticulous detail how to counter British rifles, how to approach American machine gun positions, how to disperse against mortar fire, how to infiltrate past defensive wire. Shotguns appeared only rarely in Japanese training manuals, mainly because they were uncommon on Asian battlefields, so Japanese planners did not consider them an important threat. This wasn't merely an oversight. It reflected a deeper cultural assumption about what constituted a proper military weapon, an assumption rooted in European military traditions that the Japanese had adopted wholesale during their modernization. American military thinking followed a different path entirely. The United States had always maintained a more pragmatic, less tradition-bound approach to military equipment. If something worked, Americans would use it, regardless of whether it appeared in classical military doctrine. American forces often surprised Japanese units with a wide range of practical weapons and tactics, and shotguns were only one small part of this larger advantage. The weapon that embodied this American pragmatism was the Winchester Model 1897, a shotgun designed by the legendary John Browning and refined through more than 40 years of production before the United States entered World War II. When the military adopted it for combat use, they specified a 20-inch barrel, added a perforated heat shield to protect the shooter's hand during rapid fire, and included a bayonet lug compatible with the M1917 sword bayonet. But the feature that made the Model 97 particularly devastating in close combat was something Browning had included in the original design. The weapon lacked a trigger disconnector. What this meant in practical terms was that a Marine could hold down the trigger and simply work the pump action, firing as fast as he could cycle the mechanism. This slam-fire capability allowed a trained shooter to empty all 6 rounds in the magazine in roughly 2 seconds, a storm of lead that no Japanese soldier, no matter how determined or well-trained, could advance through. The Winchester Model 1912, developed by Winchester engineer T.C. Johnson, improved on Browning's design with an internal hammer that made the action smoother and reduced mechanical snags, although the gun's safety still depended mainly on its manual safety catch. By 1943, the Model 12 appeared more often in some Marine units, although the Model 97 continued to be widely used, although the Model 97 continued to serve alongside the Model 12 throughout the war, though both weapons continued to serve throughout the war. Procurement records list many of the orders and production totals clearly, but the number of shotguns issued to individual combat units was not recorded in detail. But the true lethality of these weapons lay not in the guns themselves, but in the ammunition they fired. Standard 00 buckshot loads contained 9 pellets, each weighing 53.8 grains and measuring 8.38 millimeters in diameter. When fired, these pellets spread in a pattern that grew wider with distance, with a spread of about 10 inches at 10 yards, although the real pattern could change depending on the barrel and the ammunition used. In the dense jungle combat of the Pacific Islands, where visibility rarely exceeded 30 yards and engagements often occurred at distances where soldiers could hear each other breathing, this spreading pattern compensated for the difficulty of precise aiming through vegetation. Consider what this meant in the context of Japanese tactical doctrine. A Japanese soldier, trained to close distance and engage with rifle and bayonet, would attempt to infiltrate American positions at night. He would move through the jungle undergrowth, perhaps 10 or 15 yards from his objective, preparing for the final rush that his training had taught him would bring victory. At that exact moment, the range where Japanese doctrine anticipated dominance, An American Marine with a Winchester Model 97 could point the weapon in his general direction and pull the trigger. One squeeze would send 9.33 caliber pellets spreading through the darkness. Even in complete darkness, even with imperfect aim, the pattern of shot would likely find the target. And the Marine wouldn't fire once. Technical Manual TM9-285 described how the shotgun worked, including its slam fire ability, but it did not present slam fire as a widely taught or formal combat technique. It was good for night watch and jungle paths. A Marine veteran recalled in an interview from the 1980s that his voice carrying the weight of memories from Guadalcanal. But you couldn't engage at range. When the shooting started, you wanted a rifle. This honest assessment captures the essential paradox of the shotgun in Pacific combat. At the ranges where Japanese doctrine planned to dominate, the shotgun was absolutely devastating, a complete reversal of tactical advantage. But battles don't always unfold at the ranges doctrine anticipates, and the realities of Pacific combat would prove far more complex than any training manual suggested. The combat effectiveness of any weapon depends not just on the weapon itself, but also on the logistical chain that keeps it working. For the shotgun in the Pacific, that chain had a weak link that nearly cancelled the weapon's advantages: the ammunition. Standard shotgun shells in 1942 used paper hulls, a commercial design that worked well in normal climates. But the Pacific Islands presented humidity that stayed near 100% day and night. Paper absorbs moisture, and on islands like Guadalcanal, shells began to swell almost as soon as they were exposed to the air. Ammunition that loaded smoothly in California training ranges became difficult or impossible to chamber in tropical conditions. Some reports noted that the shells swelled so much that Marines had to push very hard to chamber them, something that was almost impossible to do in a real fight, something impossible during combat. A Marine on night watch might hear movement in the dark and reach for his Winchester, only to find that the shells had swollen into uselessness. What should have been powerful close-range fire became little more than a heavy club. This was not a rare issue, and on many Pacific islands the high humidity caused paper shells to deteriorate much faster than they did during training in the United States. Many units reported that after some time in the humid air, a number of paper shells began to swell and became hard to chamber, especially during long periods of rain. The shotgun's theoretical strengths collapsed against environmental reality. The experience of the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal from August 1942 to February 1943 shows how this crisis limited shotgun use in real fighting. Marines arrived with some shotguns, but official reports rarely mentioned them. During the Battle of the Tanaru, machine guns and 37mm canister rounds provided most of the firepower, and the after-action reports did not mention shotguns, likely because they were not primary weapons in that specific fight. Photographs show Marines carrying Winchester shotguns on jungle patrols, often as point men, but official records focused on rifles, machine guns, and artillery as the weapons that shaped battle outcomes. The most complete solution came on March 29, 1945, when the all-brass M19 shell was widely approved, although some brass cases had existed earlier in limited use, when the military adopted the all-brass M19 shell. These moisture-proof cases restored reliability, but the war was already nearing its end. The major island campaigns had been fought, and the moment when shotguns might have mattered had passed. This late fix helps explain why many Pacific veterans rarely mentioned shotguns in their memoirs. Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed and Robert Leckey's Helmet for My Pillow both omit them. Their silence reflected combat reality. Ammunition problems limited shotgun use so severely that, for many frontline Marine units, the shotgun did not play a major role, although it remained important for military police and some special patrol or scout teams. The the Marine Corps table of organization designated as E100, and made effective in 1943 authorized 306 shotguns per Marine division. On paper, this represented a significant allocation of specialized weaponry, distributed primarily to military police companies, pioneer battalions, and selected rifle squads for specific duties. But authorization and effective combat employment are two very different things. Each squad was supposed to have one. A veteran from the 2nd Marine Division recalled years later, but half the time it stayed with the company gear, too specialized for everyday use. This comment, casual and almost offhand, reveals the gap between official tables of organization and combat reality. Units possessed shotguns, carried them in their equipment manifest, could point to them during inspections. But when Marines actually went out on patrol or prepared defensive positions, they often found rifles more versatile for the varied demands of combat operations. Where shotguns did prove valuable, 3 specific roles emerged from actual combat experience. The first was point security during patrols, where some patrols used a shotgun for the point man in thick jungle areas, but this practice depended on the unit and was not common across all Marine divisions. The spread of buckshot helped the point man react quickly during an ambush, although it did not provide true suppression of several enemy positions and worked best only at very close range, allowing the rest of the unit to deploy while the point man maintained fire superiority. This tactic required extensive training and considerable trust between team members, as the shotgunner operated well forward of mutual support. The second effective role was night perimeter defense. Marines sometimes used shotguns at likely infiltration points because the wide pattern helped at close range, although rifles and machine guns remained the main weapons for night defense. The distinctive sound of a pump-action shotgun being cycled, that sharp, metallic chack-chack, served as both a warning to friendly forces and a psychological deterrent to infiltrators. Some American veterans believed that the pump sound was memorable. However, the limited ammunition capacity of shotguns, typically 6 rounds in the magazine, meant that shotgunners required immediate rifle support once engaged. A Marine with a Winchester could put devastating fire on an infiltration attempt, but after those 6 shots were gone, reloading under pressure while Japanese soldiers continued their assault was nearly impossible. The third role, prisoner guard duties, was perhaps the most common actual employment of shotguns in the Pacific. The psychological intimidation factor of a shotgun proved useful in rear area security and managing prisoners, though this was far from the dramatic, close combat role that training had emphasized. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project contains thousands of interviews with Pacific War veterans. The National Museum of the Pacific War holds more than 4,000 oral histories. These represent an enormous archive of first-person testimony from men who actually fought in the island campaigns. Yet detailed accounts of shotgun combat are surprisingly scarce in this vast collection of memories. One Marine, interviewed in 1985 about his experiences at Guadalcanal, provided one of the few specific recollections. It was good for night watch and jungle paths, but you couldn't engage at range. When the shooting started, you wanted a rifle. This assessment captures the practical reality that diverged sharply from the theoretical advantages. Yes, the shotgun was devastating at close range. Yes, it could deliver overwhelming firepower in the specific scenarios for which it was designed. But combat rarely unfolded according to the neat scenarios presented in training. Battles developed at unexpected ranges, required sustained fire over extended periods, demanded versatility that specialized weapons couldn't provide. The weight of the weapon, combined with its limited ammunition capacity and specialized role, meant that many Marines preferred the M1 Garand rifle for routine operations. A rifle might not have the shotgun's devastating effect at 10 yards, but it could engage effectively at 100 yards. It could fire repeatedly without reloading, and it served adequately for the vast majority of combat situations a Marine might encounter. The New Guinea campaign from 1942 to 1945 provided another testing ground for shotguns in jungle warfare. The Army issued shotguns to the 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions in New Guinea based on their operational needs in jungle terrain, although there is no clear evidence that this decision came directly from Marine experience at Guadalcanal. The dense jungle of New Guinea offered visibility that often measured in single digits of yards, theoretically perfect conditions for close-range weapons. But the same ammunition problems that plagued Marines proved even worse in New Guinea's highlands. The combination of constant rain, frequent river crossings, and extreme humidity made paper shells far less reliable, especially during long periods of rain, although they were not completely unusable in every situation. Army units that had requested shotguns based on the Marine experience often left them in rear areas, relying instead on M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles, weapons whose ammunition didn't swell in moisture. One Army unit report noted matter-of-factly, "Units that requested shotguns often left them in rear areas." This showed the gap between training theory and the real conditions faced by many frontline units. Shotguns excelled in controlled training conditions, in dry environments, in the specific close-range scenarios that instructors could construct for training purposes. But the harsh reality of jungle warfare, with its humidity, its varied engagement ranges, its unpredictable tactical situations, exposed critical limitations that wouldn't be fully resolved until brass ammunition arrived in the war's final months. Perhaps the most telling evidence of the shotgun's limited tactical impact comes not from American records, but from Japanese sources, or rather, from the striking absence of shotgun references in those sources. When Germany protested American shotgun use in World War I, filing formal diplomatic complaints in September 1918, they claimed the weapons violated the Hague Convention governing warfare. German military authorities went so far as to threaten execution of any captured American soldiers carrying shotguns, treating the weapons as illegitimate implements of war that caused unnecessary suffering. By contrast, Japan never filed formal diplomatic protests about American shotgun use. Not a single complaint appears in the diplomatic record. This silence should not be seen as unusual, because Japan had no diplomatic relationship with the United States during most of the war, and therefore it had no formal channel through which to file protests. It is difficult to compare Japan's reaction with the German protest in World War I, because the political situation was completely different, and Japan had no way to file complaints, even if it believed a weapon was causing heavy losses. Even more revealing is the absence of shotguns from Japanese military training materials and tactical documents. As the war progressed and Japanese forces developed responses to various American weapons, their training manuals and tactical directives addressed how to counter machine gun positions, how to disperse against artillery fire, how to survive American flamethrower attacks. However, Japanese training materials almost never mentioned shotguns, most likely because the weapon was not used often enough by American forces to justify a dedicated tactical response. Captured Japanese military documents rarely mentioned shotguns, and they focused mainly on the major American weapons that affected operations on a large scale. The training materials focused on countering American firepower generally, machine guns, artillery, flamethrowers, but never identified shotguns as distinct threats requiring dedicated tactical adaptations. This pattern extended to post-war interrogations of Japanese officers. When Allied intelligence officers questioned captured Japanese commanders about American weapons and tactics, the officers discussed American material superiority, overwhelming firepower, and effective combined arms tactics. Shotguns were rarely mentioned in these assessments, mainly because the interviews focused on large-scale American weapons and tactics rather than small arms used in limited situations. Officers who could speak knowledgeably about the terror of American flamethrowers, who could detail the effectiveness of American artillery, who could analyze American tank infantry coordination, These same officers had essentially nothing to say about shotguns. The Japanese military did develop specific countermeasures to American weapons that significantly impacted their forces. They built overhead cover against mortars. They dug spider holes to counter tanks. They employed reverse slope defenses against naval gunfire. They eventually learned to avoid banzai charges that played into American firepower advantages. This tactical evolution shows that Japanese forces were capable of identifying threats and adapting to them. They simply never identified shotguns as significant enough threats to warrant such adaptation. Post-war Japanese military studies analyzing the Pacific War included extensive examination of American tactics and weapons. These studies detail American artillery coordination, naval gunfire support, and tank-infantry cooperation in sophisticated tactical analysis. The near-complete absence of shotgun discussion in these otherwise comprehensive examinations suggests their minimal impact on Japanese tactical thinking throughout the war. What does this silence mean? Individual Japanese soldiers certainly encountered shotgun fire in combat. Some undoubtedly died from buckshot wounds, but the weapons never achieved sufficient tactical impact across enough engagements to warrant official attention at the command level. Japanese planners focused on the American weapons that had the greatest impact on major battles, and shotguns did not appear often enough on the battlefield to become one of their main concerns. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945 represented one of the most intense confrontations in the Pacific War. 3 Marine divisions, theoretically fielding 918 authorized shotguns according to their tables of organization, landed on an island whose volcanic ash, tunnel systems, and fortified positions created combat conditions where shotguns played minimal roles. The famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured in Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph, occurred after flamethrower and demolition teams had cleared Japanese positions. The specialized equipment that made that moment possible wasn't shotguns, but rather the M2-2 flamethrower, which could project burning fuel 40 yards into cave complexes, a range that exceeded the effective distance of any shotgun. Marines at Iwo Jima primarily employed these flamethrowers for cave clearing, with specialized flame tanks providing support for assault operations. The island's defenders, deeply entrenched in interconnected tunnel systems and reinforced bunkers, had created defensive positions that kept American forces at ranges where rifles, flamethrowers, and explosives determined outcomes. Of the 26,000 American casualties at Iwo Jima, a staggering number that represented roughly 1 casualty for every 3 Marines who went ashore, existing records attribute none specifically to the absence of shotgun firepower or failures in shotgun tactics. The timing of the brass ammunition's arrival adds a cruel irony to the Iwo Jima story. The M19 brass shells reached some units in late March 1945, after the battle's conclusion on March 26th. This meant that Marines fighting through some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the entire war were still struggling with swollen paper shells that limited shotgun employment in conditions where reliable close-range weapons might have made some difference. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 saw the full implementation of lessons learned throughout the Pacific Campaign. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, theoretically fielding 612 authorized shotguns and now supplied with reliable brass ammunition for the first time, nonetheless found limited opportunities to employ these weapons effectively. The Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa had adopted a defense-in-depth strategy, deliberately avoiding the banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles. Japanese forces occupied fortified positions in the Shuri Line, fighting from bunkers and cave systems that kept American infantry at extended ranges. In these conditions, Marine units relied primarily on coordinated tank infantry tactics, with flamethrower tanks providing close support, the same combined arms approach that had proven effective on other islands. Where shotguns did see use at Okinawa was in the final stages of position reduction, when Marine squads cleared surviving Japanese from captured fortifications and in military police units managing the massive civilian population movement, as Okinawan civilians fled combat zones. These applications, while important, represented a small fraction of the overall combat effort. Urban combat in Manila from October 1944 to March 1945 seemed to offer ideal conditions for shotgun employment. The Army's 37th Infantry Division conducted house-to-house combat through a city where every building might conceal Japanese defenders. Shotguns were employed in room-clearing operations, where their devastating close-range firepower could be brought to bear in the confined spaces of buildings. However, after-action reports from Manila emphasized flamethrowers and demolition charges as the primary weapons for reducing Japanese strongpoints. Japanese defenders quickly learned to barricade themselves in positions that prevented close approach, negating the shotgun advantage. The weapons proved most effective in surprise encounters when Marines or soldiers unexpectedly confronted defenders at close range. But such encounters, while dramatic, represented only a fraction of the systematic reduction of fortified positions that characterized the Manila fighting. American industrial capacity during World War II was truly staggering, and shotgun production demonstrated this output. During World War II, Winchester delivered a little over 1,000 newly made Model 97 shotguns and many more that came from older stocks, while the Model 12 was produced in roughly 50 to 65,000 units, depending on which versions are counted, while Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca added more. Although many shotguns were produced, they represented only a small part of America's overall wartime investment in weapons. But production numbers and combat employment are very different metrics. Many of these shotguns never saw frontline service. Training facilities needed them for instruction. Guard units across the Pacific and the United States used them for perimeter security. Military police relied on them for prisoner handling and convoy protection. Navy ships carried them for boarding and shipboard defense. Air bases used them against possible infiltrators. These were necessary roles, but many shotguns were assigned to security and support roles, which meant fewer of them appeared in frontline fighting than the production numbers might suggest. The gap between strong production and limited combat use shows that although America could have equipped many Marine squads with shotguns, practical needs kept them in secondary roles. The statistical void around shotgun effectiveness becomes clear when compared to data on other weapons. World War II produced enormous research, ammunition reports, casualty studies, and detailed analyses of artillery, mortars, and rifles. Only a small number of detailed reports on shotguns appear in the archives, especially when compared with the large studies made for rifles and artillery. This suggests there was not enough frontline use to generate meaningful data. The contrast with the M2 flamethrower is revealing. It appeared in nearly every account of cave and bunker clearing. At Iwo Jima, Marines used 27,000 gallons of fuel, and records carefully measured its impact. Shotgun ammunition records, by contrast, remain almost absent from reports of the same battles. Even the bar, the Marine Squad's base of fire, generated extensive documentation and countless veteran recollections. The relatively uncommon Browning machine gun also received detailed reporting. The lack of shotgun accounts in many interviews reflects the fact that these weapons were usually issued to small specialist groups, not to most frontline Marines or soldiers. Administrative records reinforce this pattern. Supply requisitions and repair reports show rifles and machine guns constantly needed replacement parts. Shotgun part requests, however, were rare. Armorer logs reveal rifles and machine guns wore down from heavy firing, while most shotgun maintenance involved cleaning after storage. These patterns show many shotguns spent more time in armories than in combat. Ammunition requisitions tell the clearest story. Divisions requested millions of rifle rounds and large quantities of machine gun ammunition. Shotgun ammunition requests were generally much lower than rifle ammunition, and many of them came from training facilities in the United States. These routine documents support the same conclusion. Shotgun combat use was far more limited than production numbers might suggest. The transformation of the shotgun from a limited-use weapon to an iconic symbol of Pacific combat shows how military mythology grows and why it lasts even when evidence says otherwise. The picture of a Marine with a trench gun clearing Japanese positions became part of American memory, despite only small support in official records. This myth developed over time. During and after the war, films and stories showed Marines clearing bunkers with shotguns, and these powerful images often did not match the details found in after-action reports. Hollywood loved the shotgun because it looked different, sounded powerful, and suggested American practicality. Over time, these images hardened into history. Many video games and popular books have repeated these images, sometimes showing Marines with shotguns as if they were a very common sight among regular infantry instead of a more limited role. The weapon became an icon of Pacific combat, even though documents show limited impact on real battles. Why does the myth survive? Because it supports simple and appealing stories. It shows American pragmatism, the idea of turning a hunting gun into a battlefield tool. It highlights adaptability and gives dramatic, close-range scenes that audiences remember. It also creates a symbolic contrast. Japanese soldiers shaped by warrior tradition facing Americans who use practical, effective tools. This fits a familiar American self-image. But historical accuracy shows a quieter truth. Shotguns were present in Marine units and sometimes useful, but they never matched rifles, machine guns, mortars, or flamethrowers in shaping outcomes. Several factors limited their use, including the small ammunition supply for shotguns in some campaigns, and the fact that rifles and machine guns were more flexible for most missions, so shotguns usually stayed in secondary roles. Veterans give the clearest view. Good for night watch, but you wanted a rifle when the shooting started, one Marine said. Another noted, each squad was supposed to have one, but it often stayed with company gear, too specialized. This gap between training and real combat mirrors other World War II experiences. Bayonet drills were common even though bayonet fights were rare. Chemical gas training prepared troops for attacks that never came. Training that included shotguns, like many close combat exercises, prepared troops for situations that were less common in real battles than planners had expected. International experience supports this. British, Australian, Soviet, and Chinese forces fought intense close battles without relying on shotguns. Their success shows that shotguns were not necessary for effective close combat, and that different armies could win with other mixes of weapons, which suggests that the shotgun's overall influence on the war was limited. To understand the shotgun's true place in Pacific combat, we must consider what actually determined battle outcomes on those blood-soaked islands. Artillery and naval gunfire provided the overwhelming firepower that shaped every major engagement. Pre-invasion bombardments suppressed Japanese defenses, close support during assaults broke up counterattacks, and the sheer volume of explosive power available to American forces dwarfed anything Japanese industry could provide. Aircraft and aircraft carriers determined strategic initiative throughout the Pacific War. Control of the air meant control of the sea, and control of the sea meant control of the land. The carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea, decided which side could project power across the vast Pacific expanses. Land-based air support proved crucial for ground operations, providing reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction of Japanese supply lines. The flamethrower revolutionized bunker and cave clearing in ways that shotguns never did. The M2-2 flamethrower could project burning fuel into defensive positions, forcing defenders out or killing them where they hid. This weapon led to important tactical developments and was mentioned in many accounts of attacks on bunkers and caves, and it prompted Japanese forces to look for specific ways to reduce its effects. Japanese tactical evolution specifically addressed how to survive or avoid flamethrower attacks, a recognition of the weapon's tactical significance that they never granted to shotguns. Combined arms coordination, the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, determined the outcomes of major battles. Tank infantry tactics evolved throughout the war, with both services learning to support each other effectively. Artillery-infantry coordination improved dramatically as forward observers and fire support teams refined their procedures. Naval-ground integration reached sophisticated levels, with naval gunfire support precisely targeted to support Marine advances. Superior logistics might have been the most decisive factor of all. American industrial capacity, supply chain superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over vast distances across the Pacific gave U.S. forces advantages that no tactical innovation could overcome. A Japanese officer, interrogated after the war, discussed American material superiority and overwhelming firepower as the decisive factors, and never mentioned shotguns among the weapons that made the difference. Where does the shotgun fit in this broader picture? As a useful tool for specific situations, certainly. As a weapon that provided devastating firepower in the particular circumstances for which it was designed, absolutely. But as a weapon that determined battle outcomes, that shaped Japanese tactical evolution, that featured prominently in the actual experience of most combat Marines, the historical evidence simply doesn't support that characterization. The weapons that actually defeated Japanese forces, one post-war analysis concluded, were overwhelming industrial production, superior logistics, coordinated combined arms, and relentless naval power. These proved far more decisive than the occasional blast of buckshot in the jungle. The story of Japanese forces encountering American shotguns in World War II shows how technical capability and tactical impact do not always match. It also reveals how weapons must fit into doctrine, logistics, and training to matter on the battlefield, and how military mythology can grow far beyond historical reality. Japanese infantry training did not include specific instruction on how to face 12-gauge American shotguns, and early encounters with Marines using buckshot were probably unexpected, but did not lead to new formal training. But this surprise did not change the results of the larger campaigns, because shotguns, even with clear theoretical advantages in close combat, did not have enough tactical impact to shape the overall course of the Pacific War. Several connected problems limited their usefulness. Early paper-hulled shotgun shells could swell in hot and humid climates, and sometimes caused problems, and all brass shells were introduced later in the war and improved reliability, although shotguns still played a more limited role than rifles or machine guns. The shotgun's short range made it suitable only for very specific close-quarter situations, which formed a small part of real combat. Marines also preferred versatile rifles such as the M1 Garand, which worked at many distances. Logistically, shotgun ammunition was never a high priority compared to rifle and machine gun rounds. Japan did not prepare countermeasures for shotguns, not because of a mistake, but because they focused on the American weapons that truly shaped battles: artillery, naval gunfire, air power, flamethrowers, and combined arms coordination. After the war, the Army Infantry Board reviewed many infantry weapons to see which ones should be improved, and rifles, machine guns, and mortars received most of the attention, while shotguns were kept for more special uses and did not become a major focus. The Korean War showed the same pattern. Marines mostly carried Garands, bars, and carbines. Vietnam brought some renewed shotgun use, especially for jungle patrol and tunnel operations, but even then shotguns stayed as specialized tools, not standard combat arms. Modern militaries still use them mainly for breaching and specific close-range tasks. Historical evidence, manuals, production numbers, combat reports, and accounts from both sides gives a clear picture. Shotguns existed in Marine units, were authorized equipment, and sometimes worked well, but they never reached the level of tactical importance that would change campaign outcomes or force the Japanese to adapt. The wider use of brass shells later in the war greatly reduced moisture problems with shotgun ammunition, but by then the course of the war was already being decided by American firepower, naval strength, and combined arms tactics rather than by any change in shotgun performance. The gap between history and popular mythology is understandable. The dramatic image of Marines clearing bunkers with shotguns is memorable, and it fits cultural ideas about American improvisation and toughness. But the verified record shows a smaller, more specialized role. In the end, this story teaches us as much about memory as about combat. Japanese infantry may have been surprised by American shotguns, but those weapons played only a minor role in a war decided by industrial power, logistics, and coordinated operations. If you found this deep dive into Pacific War history compelling, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. We publish new historical narratives every week, exploring the gap between popular mythology and documented reality in the greatest conflict in human history. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next story.